Greetings from the Barnum Museum in Bridgeport, Connecticut. My name is Adrienne St. Pierre. I'm the curator of the collections here at the Barnum. And today I'm hosting a special edition of Curious People Wanted in our video series. As always, we'll be focusing on an artifact in the collection, but instead of me doing a show and tell, I will be speaking with an expert who knows infinitely more than I do. Today, I'll be speaking with Egyptologist Dr. Kia Johnston, who is joining me on this recorded Zoom from her home in California. We will be talking about ancient Egyptian coffins and the workshops in Akhmim where many coffins were made. And then we'll talk about a coffin at the Barnum, which Dr. Johnston has included in her studies of the Akhmim workshops. Many of you know that the Barnum Museum has been the steward of an ancient Egyptian coffin and the mummified remains it contained for a long time, since 1894, when they arrived in Bridgeport as a gift to the Bridgeport Scientific Society. Much later, only 125 years after their arrival, it was determined that the coffin and its occupant had not begun the afterlife together. There was no way they could have, because experts who examined the body believe that this individual lived 4,000 years ago, and that's 1,500 years before the coffin was made. And the human remains, which were long thought to be that of an older man, based on the coffin inscriptions, were actually the remains of a young woman. So that's a fascinating story, and if you'd like to learn more about that, there are several videos on the Barnum Museum YouTube channel that are focused on that journey of discovery. You can find them by looking at the playlist that's titled Discovering Ippy. We learned a lot in the past 15 years about the mummified remains, but it wasn't until Kia Johnston approached us in 2019, as she was beginning her PhD studies at UC Berkeley, that we began learning more about the coffin too. And thanks to Dr. Johnston, we became aware that the coffin we have at the Barnum was similar to one at the Phoebe Hearst Museum of Anthropology. It bears similarities to others that were also made in Akhmim, Egypt. So Dr. Johnston's study was really the opportunity for us to kind of balance the picture, expanding our understanding of the coffin and its original owner, just as we had done with the mummified body. We are really grateful that Dr. Johnston included our coffin in her studies. Thank you, Dr. Johnston. May I call you Kia?
Yes, you can.
Thank you for joining me today to talk about your studies, and congratulations on earning your PhD in May of 2022. I'm really thrilled that you are here to share your expertise and help us become more knowledgeable about how the coffin was made, what you were able to figure out about its original owner, who wasn't the mummified person that came to Connecticut back in the 19th century. Just going to suggest that you start us off by telling us how you got interested in the study of ancient Egypt and what led to the topic of your dissertation on coffins made in the workshops of Akhmim.
It's a pleasure to talk about this piece, which is one of my favorite. I have many favorites, but this is one of the top favorites. So I got interested in ancient Egypt, as many people do, when I was about 12 years old, and we talked about it in third grade. But I lived in a small town, and my grandmother owned a bookstore, and she would get picture books for kids in, and she got a few picture books on ancient Egypt that had pictures of things in the British Museum. And she found out that I liked it. I liked to sit there and look at these books for hours. So she got more of me, having to babysit me as a kid. You got to keep the children occupied. And we actually didn't live anywhere with a mummy or a mummified body nearby. But there was one about a 6-hour drive away in Denver. And I remember going and seeing that woman and her beautiful coffin as when I was about 12, and just looking at her, because they had her on display at the time, and thinking, wow, she's so small, and I felt kind of like she was like me, I guess because she was
Mm.
small. And I started really wondering about who she was, who her parents were, and how she got to be in the museum. And I think most people grow out of their ancient Egypt fixation, and I kind of stuck with it.
Good for
As
you.
far as coffins from Akhmim goes, there are plenty of a lot of the coffins that you see in museums, at least the big museums, are from the city of Thebes, which was where the ruling, it was the most important temple in Egypt was, and especially in the first millennium BC, it was where the priests who kind of ruled Egypt lived, and it was it was a religious capital basically. Uh, but there were coffins that didn't quite look like the ones that I would see every day in books when I was a graduate student. And those, they ended up being from other places. And one of the most common other places that kept showing up was Akhmim. In fact, there was this coffin in the basement of the Hearst Museum that is just so bizarre looking. At the time, for me, having seen all of these Theban coffins, it was so strange looking. And I started doing research into it, and I started finding others like it, and that's kind of how I got the idea to look into pieces from Akhmim for my dissertation. So that's the story of that. But I don't think, one thing I wanted to say that I don't think most people think about, and I certainly didn't when I was 12 years old, I found this very confusing. I also found the fact that they didn't write English in ancient Egyptian, because I thought everybody back then spoke English, of course. The language in hieroglyphs is not English. But one of the other things that I found very confusing is just how long pharaonic civilization goes. It goes for about 3,000 years. And it was mind-boggling to me as a kid, and it probably is to a lot of adults too, that in the time of Pine-Bess, looking back at the pyramids being built, that was Pine-Bess is about as close to us as he is to the pyramids time-wise. They were really ancient to him. And if you look at like Cleopatra and Pine-Bess, he was about 800 years old by the time, well, actually it was a little less than that. So if you look back, he was about as old to her as the Renaissance, as the Italian Renaissance is to us. And that kind of gives you an idea of the time spans we're dealing with. And coffins and other art change over these long time spans. And so do things like mummification. They get new technology, their beliefs change, and they start to do things a little differently. And the Egyptians are a very conservative society, and a lot of times people talk about their art not changing much, but it does, and it changes in very subtle ways to reflect these changes in society that are happening.
I think that's really important to talk about this immense length of time. And by the way, for our viewers, Pine-Bess was the owner of the coffin we have, and which was made around the 25th dynasty. So it's about 2,500 years old. Thank you, Kia, for sort of making the connection between our looking back and his looking back to, as a comparison.
Yeah, I have to say right off the bat here that I'm quite bad at numerical dates. I'm good at see, again, I have to give out that fact at the beginning about how long things are, because I'm not very good at actual years and hundreds. We're dealing with spans of hundreds of years here.
Yeah, well, and of course we deal in large chunks of time when we talk about ancient history, whereas more recently we're talking about maybe decades or a century or two. So
yeah,
it is a different perspective, but clearly you had acquired a lot of knowledge already as a young person, that when you saw this coffin at the P.B. Hearst Museum, you recognized that it really was different from others. So that's great to hear that this all started when you were just entering your teens. I thought maybe you could just give us an overview about the making of these coffins and the workshops where this work was done. Like, what was the time period when the workshops at Acme were active or most active? And tell us where these were, so people have a sense of the location in Egypt.
So, the city of Akhmim is not a place that tourists go to very often these days because the boats don't stop there and the trains don't either. And there's really not a whole lot to see because there's a modern city built on top of the ancient city and temple, and most of the tombs are now under fields there. But it's about 500 kilometers south of Thebes, and I mean south of Cairo, and about 200 kilometers north of Luxor, which is ancient Thebes. So it's kind of in the middle there. It's historians like to think it is kind of being under the influence of this religious capital that was at Luxor. But Akhmim had its own nobility, and it had people who occupied temple offices at Akhmim who did not occupy them elsewhere. And these people needed coffins. So the coffin industry at Akhmim was actually it was a local industry, and it doesn't become it just kind of constantly exists throughout the first millennium BC, and there are local coffins being produced there from about 1100 BC forward until the Ptolemaic period, which is when Cleopatra lived, which is around 30 BC. And they kind of experienced two heydays. There's one heyday of coffin making and of course, what we have is what survived that's in museums these days. Yeah. So there might have been more, and this might be deceptive, but what we have a lot of coffins from around the 25th and 26th dynasty, when the Barnum coffin comes from, and then we have a whole lot more from the Ptolemaic period, which is around 300 BC to 30 BC. The industries at Akhmim, so there's not a whole lot known about coffin makers. Because we've never found a coffin workshop, and we found a few documents that deal with the making of coffins, but they all come from one city, and that city is near modern Luxor. It's called Deir al-Medina, and the people who lived in that city worked on the tombs in the Valley of the Kings. And we know that these people had a little bit of they had what are called informal workshops, according to the scholar Karakuni at UCLA, who works on these. Which means that they would use their materials, or they would get materials from people in the local community, and they would make coffins as kind of a side job to their main work that they were getting paid for, which was in the Valley of the Kings. And they left documentation on that. They like to write receipts. And one of the unusual things about the people in this village is they're literate. But unfortunately, the records from this village were about 600 years before the coffin in the Barnum Museum was made. And the only other records we have are from about 400 years after this coffin was made. So we're kind of in a bit of a dead space, and we don't know whether these people in Deir al-Medina, because they had such prestigious jobs, and you'd have the top of the top aristocracy fighting over trying to get their coffins by the same guy made but made by the same guy who was doing the tombs in the Valley of the Kings. We don't know if what is represented by them is normal for making coffins. So the best we can guess is that there is a certain element of it that was normal, and that you would have artists who were normally had other jobs, or they had jobs painting other objects like household furniture or even other funerary objects, and they would make coffins as part of that job, and that it work kind of on an informal basis with people from the community who would provide materials and pay them. And that the payment system would have been kind of a barter payment system. So they'd pay them in a donkey or whatever, and they would get a coffin in return. So these guys probably worked in these informal workshops. There was probably a division of labor between the carpenters and the painters. And so you would take your coffin, you would go to the carpenter and you would pay for him to make a coffin for you. He probably also made other things. And then you would take that finished coffin and to the painters and have them paint it for you. And the painters, there also is some evidence they may have been attached to the temple, because they certainly had access in some cases to documents that would have been in the temple archives.
And there was a lot more to painting than people generally think today, where they purchase pigments. Of course, I'm sure they must have been ground, and that in itself was a part of the process. So it wasn't quick work, I guess. Yeah, it was something that involved a lot more time just to prepare the materials in order to paint.
Well, the painting itself wouldn't have been, once they had all the materials ready to go, I don't think it would have taken very much time, but those materials kind of had to come from all over. So the main paints they would use would be ochres. So they could probably find those on the ground around Acme. They're just kind of yellow and red rocks, and then they can mix them with water and pour off that water and purify. It's called levigating, and they can purify off solid pigment, and they can mix it with something called gum arabic, which just grows on tree, it's tree sap basically, and that's the binder that makes the pigment stick to the coffin. So
Mm.
once they mixed the pigment with the gum arabic, it would be like watercolor cakes almost, and they would have their pigments ready to go and work in. Yeah.
Right. Okay. All right. That's maybe a little different than, artists we think of in Europe in the 16th century, or, using oils and that type of material. But,
Yeah,
um,
it's really the material set they had to work with was
yeah,
pretty different from them.
yeah. Talking about the coffins themselves, you read the term, cartonnage. And I think that's not familiar to most people. So maybe if you could explain that, and maybe even backtrack a little bit, because we also hear people refer to a mummy's sarcophagus. So if you wouldn't mind just clarifying the distinction between a coffin and a sarcophagus, and then tell us about cartonnage.
Okay, so coffin and sarcophagus is a little bit difficult because there are still scholars who will fight over this. And of
Oh,
course, the terms, when you translate them into other languages, get confused too. And there are a lot of multilingual Egyptologists. But in general, a sarcophagus is made out of stone and a coffin is made out of wood. And they can they have similar forms in some cases, but that's kind of the basic difference. If it's wood, it's a coffin. If it's stone, it's a sarcophagus.
mhm.
As far as cartonnage goes, cartonnage is a cool substance. So it was an ancient technology that's a lot like paper mache, and they would use it to make body containers that either laced up the back or they were hard to get into. And they were very form-fitting for the body. And what they would do was they would make kind of a mud core shaped like a body, probably, and they would mix either linen and paper, and they would do it like we do modern paper mache. They would get strips of linen or paper and kind of dip them in plaster and wrap them around this core, and then they'd scrape the core out so the thing could dry
Oh,
out. So it's basically made of layers of paper or papyrus or linen that are glued together.
and is any wood used?
Um,
I mean, or just
Not in making cartonnages.
okay.
Sometimes with cartonnages, they'll make a wood footplate, and you'll see those in museums, and they're kind of yeah, well, they look like the bottom of a person's foot, except like a plate, and they would sew those in. They'd have holes around the edges, and they'd sew them into the bottom of the cartonnage. So usually the only part of the cartonnage that was wood was the foot plate. In some places, and this is another regional difference, in coffins, they would make a face that was wood and put that on to the cartonnage.
Do you get then to like a lid with wood and the base of cartonnage, or
They usually don't
no?
combine them.
Mhm,
Yeah, no, it's usually the whole body is made out of cartonnage, and just like that foot plate and the face are wood.
mhm.
But the cartonnage goes all the way around the body and laces up the back. So it doesn't, usually cartonnages don't have a lid and a basin. They're just body envelopes.
Okay, well that
Yeah.
helps to to clarify that. Going back to the decoration and the inscriptions, can you talk a little bit about the artists and scribes? Or I know you really tried to look at these coffins associated with Akhmim in terms of, were there single people working on the entire decoration? Were there different people? Can you identify the work of individuals? And I mean, I think that's really fascinating. It sort of humanizes the craftsmanship here.
So we actually don't know a whole lot, as I said earlier, about how these pieces were, how these pieces were made and who inscribed them. In my work, basically, I built paleographical tables. So for every letter in a hieroglyphic inscription, I cut it out, compare it to the same letter on other coffins,
Mm-hmm.
and try to look at which letters are formed the same and compare that with the art. And kind of, I tried to identify separate artists. That way, it's like we can't really know who they were as a person, but we can tell which people worked on the same piece,
Right.
or we can make good guesses for some of them. But one of the things that we didn't know very much was how these artists were trained, whether they were literate, whether they were trained theologically, did they get schooled in the temple, and whether how the workflow went. So a lot of coffins have inscription on them and text in them, and I think there is a bit of an assumption, not many people really thought about it, but that you would have a person do the art in the pictures on the coffin, and then you would have a second person come in and do the text on the coffin. And actually, one thing I found is that it's usually the same person who does the whole thing. Some of the conclusions that I came to out of my own research, first of all, that I think a lot of the times it was the same person doing the art and doing the inscription. And also, I suspect the people doing the inscription were usually partially literate. They could read a little bit, but they weren't really, the language that they used to inscribe on coffins is very antiquated. It would be like us trying to write a composition in the language of the King James Bible. We would put in a lot of words that end in ETH that we just kind of made up, and lots of these and thous that aren't quite used correctly. And they do that in Egyptian coffins too. Sometimes you get the impression that they don't quite understand this very old version of the language that they're using, and that they aren't quite used to writing in these monumental hieroglyphs. And so they make a lot of mistakes. Yeah.
So when you talk about literacy, there's, the literacy of everyday life, but
Yes.
this is at a different level. This is somebody who has to acquire additional knowledge, or, is, knows something, but not everything, there is to know, and probably learns more over the course of time in their work.
Yeah. And there's certain things that they would have been able to write from memory and get pretty correct every time. And then there are other things that they would have had to get documents from like a temple scriptorium and copy them. And sometimes those documents are old, or they're worn out, or they're written in a weird way, and the person doesn't quite 100% know what they're copying, so they make mistakes, or they try to see something that they think is a mistake, but it's not, and they'll try to fix it.
Oh.
Or it's written in a direction they're not used to writing in, so they'll write things backwards, trying to correct it that way. So you get there's this whole invisible story behind the scenes of how the scribe is interacting with the document they're copying from, or the text that they've got memorized.
Yeah, this is just so interesting. I mean, it really speaks to the complexity of, your work and others as Egyptologists, and why this is so challenging and takes the knowledge gained from looking at a lot of examples, not just, a handful.
Yeah, and actually that's kind of, I do it for fun. I look at pictures of coffins on Pinterest. Spare time. Kind of relaxing.
Yeah, it's maybe an equivalent of people who like to do the New York Times crossword puzzle, but
yes.
Yeah. Well, that's great. What kinds of, and maybe we could talk about the kinds of imagery, the iconography, and then the hieroglyphs or glyphs. I mean, if you can also clarify the appropriate terms. I mean, we see register used to describe the kind of bands, horizontal bands on a coffin. But I feel like I'm just such a novice at this. If you can explain the proper terms for these things we're going to talk about that you've studied, that would be great.
All right. So hieroglyphs, it comes from the ancient Greek, meaning like sacred script, because they associated with it with priests. And they saw it in places like temples. There's actually several forms of ancient Egyptian script in the stuff you see on coffins and temples that has the little pictures of animals and various daily life objects. Those are generally used on objects that are meant to last for eternity.
Mhm.
Um, and the Egyptians kind of thought of this sort of text as the script of the gods. It's very highly ornamental and meant for display, and also meant to last for a long time. And the Egyptians would have written their ordinary documents in a script called hieratic or a script called demotic. And
Mhm.
both of those are like a cursive form of the above, and they would write it mainly on papyrus, and they would not intend for it to last forever usually. Glyph is just kind of a shorthand to refer to hieroglyphs. So you'll hear people say glyphs, and basically that just means a character.
Okay.
And it can be like Mayan glyphs or Egyptian glyphs or any sort of glyph. I got off track a little bit, but that's the difference. The hieroglyphs and glyphs are kind of the same thing. Glyph is just a colloquial
Right.
way of saying hieroglyph. Um, as far as registers and when you're looking at a coffin, um, usually, and this is also true for tomb art, the Egyptian art will do um, different kind of levels of pictures. So in Egyptian art, everything stands on a ground line. And they don't just kind of float in space, they stand on a line, and sometimes it's decorative that is used to kind of denote the ground or the floor. And a register are basically stacked sets of ground lines. So you'll have one set of pictures with people standing on the ground line, and then another set of pictures with people standing on the ground line below that or above that. And those are called different registers. Generally, it denotes a scene that is stacked vertically, basically.
Mhm.
Um, what other terms did we want to talk about here? So the term band,
Iconography. Oh, I'm sorry.
yeah. So
Go ahead.
sometimes you hear about a band of text or a band of pictures or a picture frieze. Those are kind of horizontal. The term band kind of denotes that maybe it's like a register, but narrower. At
Okay.
least that's kind of how I understand that terminology. So iconography is generally like it's basically what is being depicted in the picture. So what is being alluded to by this picture? It's not necessarily how people would have interpreted the picture, but sometimes it's used to kind of denote that too. So if you see a picture of a woman and she's got a certain emblem on her head and you say that's Isis, that is the iconography of Isis, that emblem on her head and the
So,
way she's depicted.
in other words, there are, images that you would expect to find on most any coffin, and are some more specific to the person for whom the coffin was made, or are they really all to do with the gods and the mythology?
Okay, so the point of having a coffin in ancient Egypt is basically it depicts events that happen in the funerary rituals.
Mhm.
And it also, the iconography, the pictures on the coffin are meant to put the deceased, to identify the deceased with the god Osiris. So they're meant to kind of incorporate him into the myth of the god Osiris, who I can tell about this if you would like. But he is a god who is reborn. And so the way Egyptian magic works is you kind of put yourself in the situation of a god in a myth. And the thing that happens in a myth will happen to you too if you kind of say the right words and do the right things according to the myth in ritual.
So those are the spells.
So the pictures on a coffin, yeah, yeah. So the actions, and so if you're reenacting a myth and you play the role of a god, then the thing that happens to the god in the myth will happen to you too. So the pictures on a coffin, they have two purposes. The first is to protect the god, and the second to protect the person inside, and the second is to help him or her be reborn, like the god Osiris is, and or like the solar god is every day. And so the pictures on the coffin are pictures from myth, where there's always a little ambiguity about whether the deceased is Osiris or the deceased is themselves.
Hmm.
And the deceased is incorporated into these scenes from myth. And they're placed around the body in such a way to kind of put the deceased at the center of the myth as well. So basically, they incorporate this deceased into a myth so that what happens in the myth will happen to the deceased, which is to be reborn.
Maybe this is a great time to just start taking this information you've given us and look at how it applies to the coffin that the Barnum Museum has.
Yeah.
And sort of, just be able to show those examples of the registers with their iconography and with the hieroglyphs.
So this is the coffin of Pied that you kindly provided to me. You'll see that it is actually decorated. The body of the coffin is decorated with these scenes that are separated by these decorative bands here. And the scenes, these horizontal scenes, these are the registers that I was talking about. And the one below it is another register. And so if we count them from the top to the bottom, this one up here is the first register, and the one below it is the second register. So we count from top to bottom. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. We can see that very clearly with the decorative bands separating the registers, and then the hieroglyphs. Vertical register. Those would also be called registers, vertical.
So hieroglyphs can actually be written in multiple different ways. They can be written from top to bottom, or they can be from right to left, or left to right, or they can be written in rows. So they're very flexible that way. And here you can see they're written in columns. If you look at the hieroglyphs here, if you read in the way you read a hieroglyph column and the way you know which way to read it and what order to read the characters in, is you look for the animals or the people and you look at the way they're facing. So right here, there's a picture of a person. So that's a little squatting man and he's facing off to the left there. And so because he's facing off to the left, you read the glyphs into his face. So you can read it from left to right. So when I'm reading this column here, I read from top to bottom, left to right. So the first one I would read is this one, and then this one, and then this one, and then this one. And then below that, there are two. So I would start on this one on the left because I'm reading from left to right. And I would read that one, and then I would read the one on the right. And then I would go down to the next line, left, right. So that's kind of how you read hieroglyphs when they're in columns, is you look for the way the animals are facing and you read from top to bottom.
So it's a little bit of a squiggle as then you go down reading.
Yeah, it is a little bit of a squiggle. And the way you can tell, like when they're kind of stacked together like that, the way you can tell which one to read first is you look for the animals and which way they're facing in the column in general. And usually the captions relate to the things relate to the object that they're next to, but sometimes they don't, which was kind of a problem on this coffin because there are a few of these columns that don't really clearly relate to the thing that they're next to.
So the scribe might have been copying something that he or she didn't really understand, and then they just copied it in there, maybe?
Right. Or the client might have been like, I want this text on my coffin, and the scribe didn't quite know where it should go, so he just kind of fit it in where he could. Okay. So these two columns next to Osiris, actually, this god right here is Osiris, and you can tell him because he looks like he has a bowling pin on his head. He is the god of the dead. And this caption right here relates to him, and it basically says recitation by Osiris. It doesn't say what he says, it just says that he's talking. So I guess the people looking at it, if they could read, would know what he was supposed to say in this situation. But yeah, usually the captions relate to the figures they're next to, and in fact, usually they read into the faces of the figures they're next to. So this caption reads this way, right into Osiris's face, from right to left in this case.
And is that Isis, who is the woman who's facing him?
Yes, it is. And you can tell that it's Isis because she has this little stair step thing on her head. It's hard to see on this coffin, and it's a little bit squished. But usually Isis has a little stair step on her head, and that is the glyph for the word set or throne. And that's how you tell her, is she has it on her head. It's part of her name. Her name is actually Osset. And then it gets the Greeks took that as Isis, and so that's how it comes into our language as Isis.
Okay.
Yeah.
In this particular scene at the far right, there's a figure whose skin is kind of an orangey color, and he's bald. Now, is that meant to represent the owner of this coffin as he's being kind of presented to Osiris?
It is, in fact, this is actually Put and Bess himself.
Just to help our viewers understand, navigate, we will explain the change in name. Originally Paib was thought to be the name of the coffin's owner, and thanks to Kia's work and Dr. Marianne Cloud, a more accurate interpretation has been determined of Pabasa or Pa and Bess. So we tend to revert to Paib sometimes because that was the name associated with this coffin for decades. But in fact, this new work gives us a different name.
So this is him right here. This is the owner of the coffin. And if you look at him, he's so cute. He's got, his head is bald because he's a priest. And the Egyptians had beliefs that you had to be pure to enter the temple. And part of that being pure was not having lice and being shaved. And so if you see a bald person in Egyptian art, a lot of the times that represents a priest. He's also got this neat robe that comes kind of flowing down his shoulders here. You can't see it very well because of the damage, but that's actually a very unique costume that shows up on other coffins of this type, and I haven't quite figured out what it is, because usually the robe goes in the other direction. It flows from the other shoulder. But he's got his hands raised. He's got little bracelets on his arms and on his upper arm. Those are in blue. And he's got his hand raised and his palms out. And that is a position of worship or adoration. And so the people that he is worshiping are in this scene on the other side of the coffin, Isis and Osiris here. The god Osiris is the god of death, and also the god of, he's not really the god of death. He's more like the king of the underworld and the dead king and the god of rebirth. And the story about him is that he was the king of Egypt a very, very long time ago. And his brother Seth was jealous and wanted to be the king, and invited so he plotted to kill his brother so he could become the king. And this is back when the gods were kings. So Seth invited his brother to a party, and he got a coffin at the party, and he knew that this coffin was exactly his brother's size, but he offered it as a party favor to whoever would fit into it. So all of the guests, because that's what you do, tried getting in the coffin. And of course, it's perfectly Osiris's size. He gets in, and Seth's henchmen throw on the lid, they nail it down, and they throw it in the Nile. And so Isis goes all over Egypt because she is a good wife. She's also his sister because they're gods, and there are only so many of them, and they're related. She goes all over Egypt looking for the coffin, and she finds it on the bank of a Nile, and she opens it up, and she somehow brings Osiris back to life, and she's guarding it, and Seth finds out about it somehow, and he comes with his henchmen, and they kill Osiris again and cut him into a bunch of different pieces, and they scatter them all throughout Egypt. And so in the time when this coffin was built, different cities in Egypt kind of associated themselves with different parts of Osiris that were supposed to have landed there. And we can see another part of Osiris up in this top register. So this right here, it looks a little bit like a popsicle stick or a lampshade on a lamp. This is actually a reliquary that has the head of Osiris in it that's associated with the city of Abydos. And the city of Abydos is not very far from Akhmim. But that's just kind of one more thing that shows up that ties into the iconography, about the story that ties into the iconography of this coffin. We have this Abydos, it's called the Abydos fetish, and it's the head of Osiris in kind of a reliquary, and it's depicted on this coffin. So, and it's depicted right over the chest of the deceased. So there's a bit of an association here going on between the deceased and between this relic of Osiris and the deceased, trying to associate them with each other. So the deceased gets reborn like Osiris. So Isis goes across all over Egypt with her sister Nephthys, who is this goddess who is standing right behind Osiris in this picture. You can tell her because she's got kind of a little stair step with it's not the stair steps in the Achaemenid thing. She's got this kind of box with another little box in the corner and a basket on top on her head. And that is actually her name, which is Lady of the Temple, or Nebetut, which got translated into Greek as Nephthys. Mm-hmm. So she's Isis and Osiris's sister. She's also Seth's wife. And that must have been a rocky relationship, because she takes off with her sister all over Egypt to go right this great wrong and collect the parts of Osiris. And they wrap up the parts of Osiris and they make him into the first mummy, or the first mummified body, I guess. So they wrap up the body and they mourn him. And Isis, one of her titles is the great one of magic. And so they bring Osiris back to life as this mummy. And she actually, and at this point, Isis has a baby with him. And not going to guess about how that happens. But Osiris then goes and he becomes the king of the dead, and his son, Horus, he shows up on this coffin too. Horus becomes the living king, the god of the king of the living people. And that's how Osiris is reborn and becomes the god of the dead. And he kind of becomes reborn through the act of mummification and through the mourning and magic of Isis, and through the fact that his son can now become the king on earth. So the son kind of represents his legacy. And so a lot of the art on the coffin tries to integrate the deceased into that cycle where the dead king is reborn as the king of the underworld, and his son becomes the king on earth.
In another register, which we can't see here, we'll insert some photographs of that later. We just don't happen to have a good still detail of it, but there's the embalming scene, correct, with Horus doing the work there on Pawn Bess. Is that
and
correct?
It's not really clear whether what's depicted there is a ritual where Pawn Bess is being embalmed, or whether this is a mythological scene in which Horus is taking care of his father Osiris. And that ambiguity is intentional. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so it can apply either way, and that's a good thing.
Yes. This bottom register here depicts the deceased getting his heart weighed. And I think a lot of people probably know that once you do manage to get reborn, you do this journey through the underworld and you end up in the palace of Osiris. And you have to be judged, whether you've been a bad person on earth or a good person on earth. And the Egyptians, they were a little bit legalistic. They didn't have a list of things that you should do. They had a list of things that you should not do. And when you were judged, you would sit there and recite the things that you did not do. I did not take food away from children. I did not deprive a widow of her belongings. So there were plenty of loopholes there you could get through. But I'm sure that Pawn Bess was, he was a good person in his own right. And he didn't have to exploit the legalistic loopholes to get through the judgment. Mm-hmm. But your heart would be weighed against the weight of a feather. And if your heart was heavier than the feather, then you got devoured by this monster that's sitting here below the scales, which looks kind of like a lioness, looks kind of like a dog / lioness / hippopotamus. It's kind of an interesting creature, but it is the devourer. Ammit is the name of this goddess. And then once you passed the judgment in the underworld, you would get to go meet Osiris, the king of the dead. But this coffin has a twist. Instead of Osiris presiding over the judgment of the dead, you have the sun god presiding over the judgment of the dead. And you can tell him because he's got a falcon head and this solar disc on his head. And this is actually a peculiar feature to some coffins from Achaemenid and some from Thebes too, but it's more characteristic of these pieces like Pawn Bess's from Achaemenid, that the judgment is actually in front of the solar god instead of in front of the god Osiris. And Osiris has his own register where he's with Isis, where he's with his sisters and the deceased is worshiping them. Mm-hmm. But the actual judgment is in front of the solar god. And then there's this wonderful snake who is standing on his tail here, and I just love his smile.
He really is a character.
Awesome. Yeah. I love this one. He's fantastic. I just love him. And he's got a little beard. So
And
this is
eyelashes too.
he does.
Lower eyelashes. Yeah.
Yeah, and he's standing on the tip of his tail. He's kind of a fat snake standing on the tip of his tail, and that's kind of one of the hallmarks of the artist of this coffin is the way he draws this snake as being kind of short and fat with the smile. But this is the god Atum, and he is the creator of the universe. He's an aspect of the solar god here, who is a little bit smudged. You can see the solar disc on his head.
Yes.
He's an aspect of the solar god, but he is the creator of the universe. This snake god, and I think his snake form kind of gives this impression of him as being very abstract and mysterious. Because the Egyptians they kind of thought of snakes as a little bit scary and a little bit mysterious.
That's interesting.
So that's
that snakes have that role in multiple cultures. Is the heart just to the right there of the snake?
So you can't really see his heart. You can see the little feather down on the scale pan here. You can see the scale and the little feather down in the scale pan. And then you can see this monster Amit, this devourer here. And she's she has an action pose in this scene. She's got her tongue hanging out of her mouth here. She's got the head of a hippopotamus and the body of a lion on this coffin.
Yeah, it definitely is an action pose when you start to see the body, and then the head is turned. I guess that her head is turned, with the tongue sticking out. A lot going on there.
And I just love how red that tongue is. And then I showed her to somebody, one of my friends, and she's like, I said she looks kind of like a little dog, and my friend told me, oh, she's had puppies too, so she's very obviously a female. Female animal.
Okay.
She's got a bosom.
Yes. Wow. All those little details there.
And here is the god Anubis. Here is the one who weighs the heart.
Is that the heart?
That is a little plumb bob that looks like a heart. The heart is actually on the scale on the damaged side. We can't see it.
It's not there then.
Yeah, they kind of made this weird reduplicative plumb bob on the scale. Looks like his heart.
Okay.
But I just love that Anubis. He's just so well drawn.
Yeah, in this little segment you have between the snake and the devouring figure and the jackal, it's quite lively.
Yeah, this scene is just so beautiful in this piece. And then we have this wonderful little baboon sitting on top of the scale. That's the god Thoth, who writes down the results. He shows up as a baboon sometimes.
Okay.
And you get him, he gets depicted sitting on top of the scale every once in a while. So that's who he is.
So we don't know what the results are. We're just that, that this is
we're going to assume he passed. Yes. The Egyptians never depict anything bad. Anything bad for them, at least. I believe the next register down is that mummification scene. But we can look at the Osiris in a tree here. That's a good scene. So here's the bottom part of the coffin. You can see the very bottom of that mummification scene with the jars underneath the bed that he's laying on.
And the crisscross of the horizontal figure above, is that representing the mummified, the wrapped body?
So a lot of the times mummies from mummified bodies from this period have bead networks on them. So they have these big networks made out of blue beads, and the outer wrapping would have been dyed red. So it's very realistic in that way. A lot of the times that red linen does not take dye very well, so that red has faded on most of the linen shrouds that survive to today. But this is what an ideal prepared body would have looked like in that period, with the crisscrossing blue bead network and the red shroud underneath it. And that is very Osiris. When you sometimes pictures of Osiris are shown that way too. In fact, there's this mummified falcon picture at the bottom, and we'll talk about him in a second. He's pretty cool, but he has the same thing going on here with the crisscrossing beads over the red shroud. So this scene right below, this register right below this mummification scene, is very unique to coffins from the city of Akhmim. And when you see this scene on a coffin, you instantly start to suspect this is an Akhmim piece. And we actually don't know too much about what exactly it symbolizes. Is there a particular ritual or place that it is symbolizing? Several people have speculated on it. But here we see the god Osiris, again recognizable because of his hat and his green face. Usually gods of fertility and gods of the underworld have green faces, and it's supposed to kind of represent their fertility and rebirthing qualities. But here he is mummified. He's wrapped up in a shroud, but he's got his little hands sticking out, and he's holding all of these kingly. He's got a flail and a crook like King Tut has at the King Tut in his burial. And he's holding all of these implements of kingship, and he's standing in the branches of two trees that are kind of growing out of a raised tree bed here, if you can see both of them. Yeah. And on either side of these trees are two big obelisks. Have you seen the Cleopatra's Needle in New York?
No.
These big stone obelisks with the pointy tops, that's what those are.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, on either side of the tree. And they have solar connotations. So basically, it's him standing in these trees between the two horizons. So there's some sort of merging of solar and Osirian symbolism that's happening there. But as far as if it depicts an actual event or an actual place, we're not really sure about that. And scholars would like to know, but not much of the Akhmim temple remains, so we don't know a lot about local religion there.
And is one of the stylistic attributes that's special to this the kind of dappled background?
Yeah, so this background right here, the yellow part looks like varnish. Usually the varnish kind of turns yellow on the top. But if we look at the tree itself, it has kind of the foliage in the tree is kind of just stamped or brushed on there in a very kind of abstract way that looks very modern. And that is also a characteristic of some of these pieces from Akhmim.
Okay, I was reading it as background, but you say it's meant to represent the foliage of these. Okay.
Yeah, the way they've kind of dappled on that green is supposed to kind of represent leaves.
I see. Okay.
And it's actually a very unusual way for the Egyptians to represent that. It's quite cool.
Impressionistic.
Yeah, it's really unusual for Egyptian art. And that's another characteristic, a lot of these coffins. The one in the Hearst Museum is a little less impressionistic than this one, but it almost looks like pointillism because they've taken a plant stem and they've dipped it in that green paint and they've just stamped it everywhere. So it's just lots of little points.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that's really very unusual. It's a really kind of an unusual way to do that in Egyptian art.
Well, it's a beautiful little segment there.
And there's the god Thoth. You can see his beak. And usually these scenes have Thoth on one side and the god Horus on the other side. Mm-hmm. Horus being the son of Osiris. But here they're kind of they're hard to see because they're a bit damaged.
Okay, and then
also here it's kind of interesting because you can see a little bit about how the coffin was constructed originally. You can see there's a layer of that it was carved wood, and they put a layer of linen over it. And sometimes they do that to provide a nice canvas to paint on, and sometimes they do it because the wood underneath is made the surface underneath is made out of lots of little bits of wood that have been kind of doweled together, and they do it to kind of reinforce and strengthen the surface. Mm-hmm. And it can look a little bit like cartonnage because it's linen kind of soaked in plaster that they're kind of draping over it.
Yeah, I guess that was kind of maybe some of my confusion about the term. Yeah. What was this coffin that we were looking at? Because it did have this sort of non-wood look to portions of it. But I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, they used a similar technique to the cartonnage to kind of stabilize the top of the wood when they're making some of these wood coffins. Because in ancient Egypt, they don't have very much wood. And so they kind of have to use every little bit of wood that they can get their hands on. And sometimes they have kind of nasty little pieces of wood that they have to dowel together. And they kind of do that to reinforce it.
Be very careful how they used it. I guess that might be why coffins were expensive too.
Yeah, exactly. And we don't actually know how they got the wood. Did the temple have a store of it? Did the people who were buying the coffin have to provide it? I actually think it might be the latter, because you get a lot of like pieces of wood that are from furniture, from other coffins. It's kind of like they just kind of went salvage. They went salvaging for it.
That's a good point. Okay, so what's below this one now? We have a
So
view
below this
here
scene,
now.
oh my gosh, I love this guy. Okay. So we have this scene on the foot, and this is also usual for coffins from Acme of this type. We have a mummified falcon. He represents the god Sokar, who I actually don't know a whole lot about the mythology of Sokar. He is also a mummification and deity of death and rebirth, but he's more associated with the city of Memphis. But he also shows up on a lot of coffins of this type all over Egypt. But that's what he is. He's a mummified falcon, and he is also kind of a god of rebirth. He's got some neat little details on him. And one is this eye that has this beautiful spiral around it. And I'm not really sure what's going on there, what that's supposed to represent, but it's so cool.
Yeah, he's very
And then
prominent.
this is the only coffin that has that detail of the eye, and it's fantastic. And then he has this little detail in front of him, which also I'm not quite sure what it is supposed to mean, but it's a papyrus stem. You can see the top of it. It's a bunch of papyrus stems that have kind of been tied together. And then it has a little tiny falcon on the top and a little tiny snake. You can just see the head of the snake, and he's got a little crown. So I need to do some more research on what that actually symbolizes. But he's not named on the coffin. The caption that usually occurs next to this figure is it says, "He who is on his papyrus stalk," and I'm like, wow, that's helpful, thank you. But
Stating the obvious, right?
yeah.
Well, I can appreciate the challenges that you had with our coffin because, zooming in, getting these details, people can really see that there's a lot missing. There's a lot of damage. And I just also wanted to add, although we do have actually another video about this, but the Barnum Museum received the coffin in 1894. The coffin and its occupant were sent here by P.T. Barnum's widow, Nancy Fish Barnum. She was traveling abroad, and when she was in Egypt, the American consul gave her the coffin to present to the Bridgeport Scientific Society. And they unwrapped the body, which, as I mentioned, was much later discovered not to have belonged to the coffin. But we don't know what condition exactly the coffin came in. Probably it was at least somewhat better than what we see now. But you mentioned to me when I apologized for the condition that you have seen things that are more or less fragmentary. So we at least have something to go on. But I so appreciate your expert eyes and looking at this and being able to kind of fill in, where you see, well, this particular figure, this god should be here, another one should be here, and the kind of inscriptions that would be there. But you've certainly given us a tremendous reading of this, which it's so exciting to be able to walk through visually the registers and understand the meaning so much better than we did.
Oh, thank you.
So I know that you're embarking on a great future and career as an Egyptologist. Do you want to say something about maybe how your dissertation studies of this workshop fit into the bigger picture, or what questions that you're on the trail now to try and answer? I mean, inevitably, when somebody does research, it leads to more questions. And I just wondered if you wanted to offer any thoughts about that.
So how my research fits into the bigger picture. So we don't know a lot about how coffins were produced. And I think my research kind of provides a lens onto, I think it was probably a much smaller operation, and that there were fewer people working on these things than was previously thought. I think it also kind of humanizes the people working on it, especially in lieu of an explanation of all of the spelling mistakes that occur to it. It kind of looking at how common those were kind of gives the impression that these people were trained very they were very familiar in their mythology, and they were very playful with some of the scenes on the coffins and how they incorporate the deceased into the scenes and the different deities they include. So they were religiously trained, and they were very, very familiar with all of this rebirth um, mythology. But sometimes they seem to have been partially literate. They seem to have been able to write certain things and not been familiar with a lot of other texts. So these were not the best scribes in the temple, if they indeed worked for the temple. They were better artists than they were scribes. But I think that really kind of humanizes them a little bit, to kind of know at least a little bit about how they worked and how they were trained. As far as Akhmim goes, most of the coffins that people see are from the city of Thebes. And so when people are talking about coffins and how to date them and how to think of the symbolism on them, they're mainly thinking and using as examples Theban coffins. And I suspect that there is a lot more regional, we know that there's a lot more regional variation in Egypt, especially in times of political fragmentation. Different areas of local power tend to kind of start to express these local ideas in their funerary art in a way that they wouldn't when there is a big, strong central government and everybody's trying to imitate the central court or the most powerful temple in the land. So I hope my work kind of leads to people starting to appreciate more that there are regional differences in coffin art. And these probably reflect slight regional differences in belief too. Even if that is that certain rituals were more important in Akhmim for the deceased than they were in Thebes, and vice versa. And I hope that people start to think of ancient Egyptian art in the first millennium BC as being kind of more of a mosaic of different traditions than just the Theban tradition and everybody else who is kind of poorly imitating it.
Yeah.
Because as we can see from this coffin, it's very, very fine. These people were good artists working for the local Akhmim nobility. And they could definitely hold their own against any of the big Theban artists and any of the Memphis artists.
Yeah. Well, I mean, all these details that you've pointed out really, really speak to that. And, I appreciate having the opportunity to learn so much more. I wonder if we could just hop back a bit to talk about Ponbes as a priest. You mentioned that he would have been a stolist priest. And I wondered if you could explain a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the main temple in Akhmim was the temple to a god named Min. Min was a fertility god. He mainly the fertility of fields, not so much death. Not Osiris took that part. But the main gods at Akhmim were Min and actually Isis as well. So in Akhmim mythology, Isis and Min go together, and there's some association between both Min and Osiris and Min and Horus, although they're different gods. And so the local cults in Akhmim generally revolve around either Isis or Min. The Ponbes he held several titles. He was a very important man. He was the third priest of Min at the temple at Akhmim, which means that he was pretty much the third highest ranking guy in religion at Akhmim. And he was also a stolist priest. And stolist priests were fairly common, but they generally, part of the daily ritual in the ancient Egyptian temple is they had this statue in the temple, which acted kind of like as an interface for the god. The god could come reside inside his house, inside the statue in the temple. And so they needed to take care of the statue and do proper research, proper rituals for it every day, so that it was a safe place for the god to come and live, a safe and pleasant place for the god to come and live. And part of those rituals involved feeding the statue, giving the statue offerings, presenting the statue with incense, making it so it smelled nice around the statue, and putting clothing on the statue. And the stolist priest, we don't know too much about what he did, but we know that he probably was involved in putting the clothing or the robes on the statue. And there are several gods that we have stolist priests for, but we have a lot for the god Min because he's kind of a naked man, and he needed to be clothed sometimes. So
He had pointed out the unusual way in which the robe was draped, and that little image on the side upon Bess. And he said, well, normally that it would have gone the opposite. I don't know if could that indicate the clothing he carried to put on the statue, or maybe
that is a good question. I don't know. And there's not a whole lot of literature on it. Again, we don't know that much about the Temple of Min at Akhmim. But there are a few other coffins where where the deceased is wearing that outfit, where and the titles don't overlap. So I'm not sure whether it's just an Akhmim outfit, if it's specific to the time, or what. It might have to do with his job. Actually, that's a good idea, that it might have been the stole for men that he was carrying over his shoulder. I have to look into that a little more. That's a cool idea. I like it.
Well, it just occurred to me because you pointed out that the way it was depicted was different from what you normally see. So, then you sort of wonder, well, was there a reason it had a different meaning than the usual? So just an idea. Yeah.
The owner of the Hearst coffin is also, and there's another guy named Pa and Bess, and he has different titles too. He's actually also a stolist, I think, but his coffin is in Lisbon. Mm-hmm. And also UFA, who is the owner of the coffin in the Hearst Museum, is also wearing that outfit. So it seems to be like this time period, but also Akhmim. Mm-hmm. And we don't know. So maybe it is the stolist thing. We don't know UFA's titles. So this picture right here next to Isis actually gives us a lot of information about who Pa and Bess was, and who his family is. And we actually have several generations of his family here. So the discussion about him actually starts right here in this kind of damaged area, and it's hard to see. So when a person died on their coffin, they're usually called an Osiris, and that means that they are in the following of Osiris. But it also serves to kind of associate them with the god. And so you can tell that the name of the deceased is going to start because of this group right here, which is hard to see, which is the name of the god Osiris. So this says the Osiris, and then these glyphs are gone. And then you can see this one right at the very bottom. It looks like a wedge through a line. That means stolist. Okay. So yeah, it's really hard to see on this coffin. It shows up on other coffins, which is kind of how I could tell what it was. And also I used image enhancement software. It makes it a little bit more obvious. So then we go over to this next line here, and this is an eye right here. It is a reed leaf glyph. And this is the name of the city of Akhmim. It's Ipu, and half of it's destroyed, but we can see enough of it left to know what it is. So he's a stolist of Ipu. He's a stolist in Akhmim. And this right below here is you can see it's a little crouching jackal. You're gonna have to take my word on this, maybe. But it's a little crouching jackal, and he's kind of on a standard. So this is Anubis, the god Anubis. Okay. And below that is the word the mother of the god. So he's a priest of Anubis and the mother of the god, who is Isis, because she's Horus's mother. And of course, there she is right there. We can see the back of her head. And this right here, this kind of flag, is the word God. It's Netcher. And behind it is the word Hem, which means servant. So servant of the god. And the word Hem Netcher generally just means priest. Mm-hmm. And this is the term, the third priest here. This has got a 3 underneath this. So it's Hem Netcher, 3 Nu, which means the third. So he's the third priest of the god Min. And this kind of gosh, I don't know what it looks like here.
It's a little bit like a hammer or something. But
yeah, it's kind of like a hammer, or like once you know what it is, you see that it's a standard with some flags draped over it, and then it has a thing on the top of it. And then here's his name right here, which is Pa, and then there's this glyph, which could be an I, which is a reed leaf, or it could be an S, which is drawn backwards. And this character right here is a bee. And then this is the tail of an animal. It's a pelt with a tail hanging from it, but it's a little bit smudged here because the guy was painting with a reed that was chewed on the end, and he smudged the ink a little bit.
I see.
And then this is it means it's a plural, which I don't know why they use that there. This is probably the name of the god Bes, and Bes is a god of childbirth, who was meant to protect vulnerable babies and children, and he was very important to just ordinary Egyptians. And we have a lot of people named Pa and Bes, or the one of Bes, because a lot of people, when their baby was born, they didn't know whether it was going to live, and so they wanted to give it a name that would associate with the god that was going to protect it, and so they would name it the one of the god Bes. The name used to be read as Paib or Paib, which is understandable because this bird right here is Pa, and then we have this thing right here, which is ambiguous, but it looks a lot like a reed leaf, which is the sound E. And then this foot right here is the sound B, so Pa-ib. And ib is a word. It can mean two different things. It can mean a heart, or it can mean a baby goat, like a kid. And because it has this animal tail after it, that would mean we should prefer the baby goat meaning, because this animal tail tells us that whatever is prior to that is somewhat related to animals or to non-human things. So the name in the past was interpreted as Paib, but on other coffins, the word Bes, the name of the god Bes, is spelled this way. And in that case, these two symbols are switched and this one is flipped horizontally. So it's a scribal error for Bes that he made it written so that it looked like Ib instead. And one of the ways that I don't think this is Pa-ib is if we look up here at the very top in the word Ipu, this is that reed leaf that is the eye. You can see it's very skinny and a little bit curved and kind of pointy at the top. And that is definitely an E there. Ipu. And then we look at this one and it's rounded at the top and it's not curved at all. So I think it's probably an S character, which is like a folded piece of cloth, and they've just drawn it backwards. And anybody who is just starting to learn hieroglyphs knows that this S character is facing the opposite way than you would think it should be. And so a lot of beginner hieroglyph people today will draw that S character backward.
Wow, that's amazing.
So even today, it's a common mistake. But this text below it says that this is an egg. It's the son of, and then this is his father's name. So his father is Padi Aset or Padi Esse or Padi Isis. This is the name of the goddess Isis right here. So the one who belongs to Isis. Again, we want to associate our kid with the god who's going to protect them because infant mortality is so high. And
so
then
genealogy here.
Yeah, it's his genealogy. And then we have, I think, his grandfather's name over here, which is really it's too bad that it's partly destroyed. And it doesn't say son of anywhere, but this is actually a pretty common name. And so I think that it's probably meant to be the father of this last person here. And this name right here is Pakaru. So Pakaru means the Syrian, and it is a pretty common name. We don't know if his grandfather was Syrian or if he just reminded somebody of somebody who was Syrian. But it's actually a pretty common name during this time period.
As is the Pa and Bes too, correct?
Yeah, Pa and Bes is there are a lot of very important famous people named Pa and Bes during this period. So it could be possible that he was named after one of them too. And in fact, there is another coffin that is a lot like this one, in which the name is misspelled in the same way in Lisbon. And the owner of that coffin is also a Stolas priest named Pa and Bes. And they may have been related, but names are very common at Akhmim, just like they are today. There are several names that everybody in Akhmim has during a certain period, so they may not be too.
It would be like Michael today, or
exactly,
or David, a name that you know many people with that name. Yeah. Well, and that's so interesting that the misspelling was the same on this other coffin too. So. And
that's one of the reasons I think the other coffin was by the same artist, because he made the same mistakes in the name.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it wasn't a mistake to him. Maybe that was
no.
How he
it's readable.
Yeah.
That's the way I think about
Yeah.
it. If it's readable, it's fine.
Hmm. Well, this is terrific to get this magnified view and really understand what all these tiny little elements mean. It's opens up a new world.
Yeah, no, and it's been a pleasure to talk about it with you too. This has been a fun piece, and it's been wonderful talking to you about the piece and its history.
Same. Well, thank you again, Kia. We really appreciate your work to help us understand the coffin, and we again, congratulations on your PhD, and we'll look forward to all the great things that you're going to do in your future.
Thank you very much, and stay in touch.
All right. And to our Curious People Wanted listeners, I hope you enjoyed this really deep dive into the Barnum Museum's coffin. And I hope you'll be back joining us again. And in the meantime, I hope you'll stay curious.